Lesson 63, topic: How the spiritual hierarchy relates to the levels of reality and the Father's influence on this complex and interconnected world. Greetings, brothers and sisters, I am Ola, and I will address a topic I haven't touched on before: how the levels of reality relate to each other, how the reality of the physical world is generated, and how these levels relate to the spiritual hierarchy and the Father as a controller of this entire complex system. First, I will remind you that in the levels of reality, the objects that exist in the physical dimension also exist in the higher levels of reality. They exist as an energy that represents them as a simplified energy, and this simplified energy relates to all the other elements that exist in these levels of reality. Therefore, what is being created is the same simulation we have in the physical world. We have it in all the levels of reality. Each of these objects that exists on the levels of reality generates its own energy. This energy has its own intelligence, so to speak, and this intelligence is what ensures that these elements have sufficient self-control to relate to one another. This doesn't mean that there aren't spiritual entities from the spiritual hierarchy. Of course they exist. They appear from time to time, coming to interact with these elements and bring about changes. This explains why the creative magic I described earlier works so effectively. Those of you who practice creative magic are generally interacting with the energy that controls these elements. When you wish for a certain event to occur, what you are doing is telling the energetic elements that control these simulated elements of the real elements of this physical world to relate to one another differently, to bring about change in the reality you inhabit. By changing their behavior, you change how these elements relate to one another, and from there, change occurs in the elements of the physical world. At the levels of the spiritual hierarchy, there exist spiritual entities that are united with the Father. In turn, the Father is united with these spiritual entities, and together they form, so to speak, a spiritual supermind that controls the entire universe. Evidently, for this spiritual hierarchy to make changes in the physical world, it must interact with the elements that exist at the higher levels of reality. This is why this interaction is so important. The elements of the higher levels of reality, as you may believe, do not have an infinite lifespan in time or space. They depend on the survival of the elements that exist in the physical reality, unlike the elements of the spiritual hierarchy, which are eternal. This means that if an element of physical reality needs to last longer, the corresponding angel of the spiritual hierarchy or the angels that are in charge of the task will have to interact with the physical reality, modifying this element so that it lasts for the time necessary to fulfill the Father's plans. In other words, when a person dies or when an object is destroyed, that object disappears from the higher levels of reality, and in turn, the energy that created it disappears, and therefore control over the object disappears. However, it doesn't disappear entirely. Its information is stored in the energetic part of the universe, in the higher levels of the reality, far above the levels that are close to the physical world. It is stored in the form of information, and this information is interconnected, forming a network in which, if one has sufficient capacity, one can search for information and see the origin of the ramifications, even if a great deal of time has passed. This information is also accessible through the Akashic records, which store all the information of the universe, what has happened, what is happening, and what may possibly happen. If your desire is to perform creative magic to change this reality, you can make it much more effective. You not only have to interact with the higher levels of reality, as I already mentioned in a previous lesson, you have to interact above all with the spiritual hierarchy, get in touch with them, as I already explained in other lessons. To modify reality, sometimes you have to access the fourth or the fifth level of the spiritual hierarchy. Only the higher levels, those closest to the Father, they hold the key to controlling the elements that exist in the higher levels of reality, and therefore they can change the behavior of these elements. It's much easier than simply accessing the levels of reality. Therefore, I recommend that to perform more effective creative magic, you interact with the higher levels of reality and simultaneously with the spiritual hierarchy. This can be done at the same time. What you need to do is that when you are in the higher levels of reality, something which I have already explained, communicate with the spiritual hierarchy that is in charge of modifying these elements. To do this, simply concentrate a little more while in these higher levels of reality and ask the Father to send the angels in charge of controlling these elements. The Father will grant you will grant your request if his modification of reality is viable, and if not, he will tell you. If you are able to hear him, you will hear the answer. If the Father says that the changing reality is not good, he will tell you anyway. For those who haven't heard the lesson on creative magic, before performing it, you must speak with your Father to confirm whether it can be done, whether it will have positive or negative consequences, and above all, whether it is in your plans for it to come to fruition. I won't repeat everything I said in the previous lesson on this topic. I refer you to it. Once the angels in charge of modifying the elements of the levels of reality are with you in these higher levels of reality, and therefore with the elements involved that represent the objects of physical reality, you can perform it more effectively. With both elements close to you, you simply have to visualize the change you want to bring about. The angels are very sensitive to these thoughts. The elements are also very sensitive, and the energy that is created connects these elements and feeds back and forth between the angel and the element and you. It creates a very powerful energetic imprint that interacts rapidly with the Father, ascending very quickly. In just a few sessions, you can make creative magic more effective. You can achieve things that previously seemed impossible over time. It will be more difficult if you wait for reality to arrive and bring about the change. You can wait a very long time for this to happen, although it usually occurs when the Father desires it. But if the Father's plans align with your desires, he can accelerate it. Now, let's look a bit at the topic of the multiverse. It's true that there isn't just one universe. There are several, on the order of 15 or maybe even 100, depending on the energy conditions. Most of these universes have a very short lifespan, lack the energy to survive, and not viable. Around 80% tend to disappear in a very short time. They are not viable. Those that are viable, at most 5 or 6, or sometimes maybe even 7. These are the ones that can truly endure for a very long time, and they are ones capable of communicating with each other. Universes with short lifespans and short durations generally cannot easily communicate with the rest of the universe. They don't share energy or matter, and that shortens their lifespans. Universes that can survive generally communicate with each other with relative ease. You are familiar with the dimensional holes that occur on your planet, in which strange beings appear. These are beings that usually come from another universe, from other dimensions, sometimes from other planets within this universe, but they come through a different mechanism, one they are capable of creating themselves. They help each other regarding certain natural phenomena to create them more easily. In the case of inhabitants from other universes, what happens is that they use certain natural mechanisms that create holes between the universes, and they can pass from one to another. These holes open periodically and in very precise locations. Sometimes a rotating phenomenon occurs in the appearance of these holes. There is a certain periodicity that is maintained over time and in a certain range of places. It is as if they appear periodically along a circle, always tracing the same circular line. Each unit of time they appear in a different place, but always within the same space. That is why the places where these dimensional holes appear and these strange apparitions to you are repeated. If you were to see it from another perspective, you would realize that they are linked to each other and that they belong to the same dimension. The physical dimension in which we live does not only have 3 dimensions. These places are connected to each other and form a unity beyond physical reality. I could explain a method for predicting when these communication holes between universes will occur, but for now I haven't been given this permission to do so. I'll only say that it has to do with magnetic anomalies and the value of the magnetic field in these locations. There's often a correlation between these places, which have certain magnetic anomalies of the same frequency and often of the same intensity. That can provide a clue. For now, I'm not allowed to say anything more. And now I'll talk about the last aspect I haven't mentioned. What happens with the Father and the multiverse? Can he control the multiverse? The answer is that there isn't just one Father, but rather Allah is a Father created for each universe. Each universe has its own spiritual hierarchy, which often coincides with that of another universe. They share angels and duties, and above all this, the minds of the lesser fathers in each universe unite and form an omnipresent Father, a Father who summarizes all the knowledge and capabilities of the lesser fathers. It's like a symbiotic mind that unites all the knowledge of the others and works in parallel with them. This means that the spiritual evolution of these universes separately can be different, but they all have the same objective, to unite with the Father. You might be wondering if the levels of heaven are the same for each universe. Each universe has its own structure. Sometimes a deceased person can pass to the heaven of another universe to continue with the spiritual development or to fulfill the Father's plans. The matter isn't so simple. A deceased person can pass to another universe with relative ease. The higher levels of heaven are indeed unified. There is only one garden and one upper level of the garden for all the universes. All the deceased who manage to reach it and all the higher spiritual entities capable of reaching this level so close to the Father go to the same place, the same garden, and see the same Father. Regarding the lower levels of heaven, obviously each one has its own, because it has to carry out its evolution separately. But in the higher levels, the energy is common to all universes, and the evolution at this level is already very similar in all universes, and therefore only one garden and one common Father are needed to control everything. Each planet in each universe has its own levels of reality, close to its physical reality. However, they communicate with each other, sometimes in a very subtle way. They are transferring information because what happens in one universe sometimes influences another. The Father's plans are mysterious. When you do creative magic, you are doing it in your own dimension, in the higher levels of reality. If you want to do it in the multiverse, you have to access the Father directly. But that is already far beyond your level. You can be satisfied if you can change your reality by acting on your own levels of control over your physical reality. Well, I think that's enough. I don't want to go on any longer. So until next time, brothers and sisters.